The chemistry of baking bread. Our experiment, yeast and leavening. What is yeast? Yeast is a microscopic fungus commonly used in baking. When yeast feeds on sugar, it produces alcohol and carbon dioxide. This makes it useful in fermentation of alcohol and in leavening bread, or helping it to rise, using the CO2 to form air pockets. When there is more sugar available, the yeast is able to make more CO2 because, just like with any chemical process, when there are more reactants, there are more products.
Gluten content in flour. Bread gets its structure from the protein gluten. Gluten is made from two proteins, glutenin and gliadin, who combine when flour is mixed with water. It forms a sort of net to catch gas bubbles and promote leavening. Bread flour has a high protein content because the more glutenin and gliadin present, the stronger the gluten structures there will be in the dough, which will better hold in the CO2 bubbles released by the yeast. This makes for better risen bread compared to other types of flour.
Baking and making do's and don'ts. Before you start the baking process, bread needs to have ample time to rise. If it doesn't have all of the time it needs to rise, then the bread you make will be super dense and will be very small. When baking, it's important to put a cooking stone either under the dough or under the pan in the baking process because it absorbs excess heat and releases that excess heat if the oven temperature goes down, keeping the temperature even and regulated. Don't forget to cut slits in the top of the bread, or else the crust will stop the CO2 bubbles in the dough from expanding with the higher temperature.
Given what we know about yeast, we hypothesize that if we make bread dough with a higher sugar content, the bread will rise higher because with more sugar to eat, the yeast will create more CO2.
Next, for the procedure, we're going to form two separate doughs, one with sugar and one without. We will allow the dough to rise until one lump is fully risen. Which one rose faster and higher? Next, we'll form the doughs into loaves and bake them on the baking stone at 176.6 degrees Celsius or 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Compare the two loaves of bread. Which one's larger?
Hello everybody! Today we're going to teach you about leavening, the chemical process by which baked goods rise. Usually leavening happens when a chemical reaction occurs that releases a gas, usually CO2 or hydrogen. This gas then forms air pockets in the dough, causing it to rise.
There are types of bread that are unleavened. For example, matzah is an unleavened bread eaten during Passover when eating leavened bread is forbidden.
Today we're going to focus on leavened baked goods, and where better to start than bread. This is your standard white bread that you buy from the grocery store. If you zoom in, you'll see the little pores in the bread. Those are the result of the leavening process.
And the leavening agent used in bread is yeast! Although yeast is an ingredient in baking, it's actually alive.
It's a microscopic fungus which likes to feed on simple sugars. Grossed out? Well, because yeast is used to make most kinds of bread, you've been eating it your whole life!
When yeast feeds on sugar, it produces alcohol and CO2 gas. This makes it useful in fermentation, like when making beer and in leavening bread. The CO2 will form air pockets in the dough, making it light and fluffy.
Here, before we begin baking, we're going to proof our yeast. This yeast is fresh from the store, so it's unlikely that it would be bad, but this is the perfect opportunity to show yeast fermenting power at work.
Proofing yeast is a relatively simple process. Just get some warm water, making sure it's only mild in temperature. Remember, yeast is a live organism, so it can die if the water's too high. Think like a warm bath. Then add about a tablespoon of sugar and stir until the solution has no solute left. Then just dump the yeast in.
When the yeast consumed the sugar, it began producing CO2 and alcohol. There's actually a smell of alcohol in the room right now.
This is the bubbly foam that is forming on top of the mixture. That lets you know that the yeast is alive and kicking.
Look familiar? You probably recognize this kind of reaction from making baking soda volcanoes in school. That's because the acid-base reaction that baking soda undergoes when it's mixed with vinegar forms gas similarly. That's why baking soda is also used in leavening.
Now that we know our yeast is good to use, let's get cooking.
But before we begin, here's a quick note about dry yeast. Remember how I said earlier that having the water too hot would kill the yeast? It's harmless to eat in bread because the temperature of the baking is so hot that it dies.
However, eating yeast from the package, also known as yeast that's still alive, is not advisable because the yeast can survive in your stomach and feed off the food that you eat. This results in the yeast making CO2 and alcohol inside of you, which can give you stomach pains and potentially alcohol poisoning.
Of course, if you eat a very small amount, you won't die. Just be uncomfortable. However, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't practice precaution. In the kitchen, as well as the lab, safety measures should always be taken when dealing with substances that could harm you or make you sick, even if they seem a little bit extra.
In this case, just be careful what you eat and don't lick anything off your fingers.
Okay, let's get started with the experiment. Here, we're going to test how sugar levels affect leavening in bread. Because yeast eats sugar and uses that to make the CO2 used in leavening, we hypothesize that the dough with a higher sugar content will rise higher than a dough with a low sugar content.
We have all of our ingredients out, and now we're going to make two separate bread doughs. Julia's will be made by the recipe, which has added sugar, and mine will be made with the same recipe without the added sugar.
The bread without the sugar will still rise because it will eat the complex carbohydrates and starches in the flour, but without the added sugar, it won't rise nearly as high.
So now to start. Here we have two bowls. The metal one will be for the properly sugared bread, and the colored one will be for the non-sugared bread. This way we can tell them apart. First, we'll dissolve the yeast in the warm water, about 2 cups. This is where you also add the sugar if applicable.
Okay, so we're just going to take intermission while we do this for the yeast to do its thing.
So the mixture with the sugar has already started producing gas, while the yeast without the sugar has remained stagnant.
This is because the yeast has started eating the sugar in the one mixture, while the other one hasn't been activated by anything.
Okay, so now we're going to add the salt and the flour. We're going to put in about half of the flour at first, and then keep adding 1/4 cups until the dough is sticky and formed, but not too dry and what bakers call gnarly. While I'm doing this, Julia's going to talk about flour and gluten.
So what we're using here is bread flour, which is different from the kind of all-purpose white flour that you're likely used to seeing. The biggest difference is that this flour has a much higher protein content, which helps contribute to a better rise. Sugar isn't the only ingredient that contributes to bread rising. In fact, it's only about half the process. The CO2 created by the yeast are what make the bubbles in the bread, but without protein structure, those bubbles would escape. There are 2 main proteins in bread flour, as in all flour, but there's much higher quantity in bread flour. These proteins are gliadin and glutenin. When water is added to flour, these proteins come together to form a protein network known as gluten. This network is what holds the gas bubbles formed by the fermenting yeast. Think of it like a net holding in balloons. Red flour, with its altogether higher protein content, creates a stronger network, allowing it to better trap gas, therefore allowing for better rise. This is why bread flour is so important. While you can use white flour for this recipe, it will result in dense, low-risen bread. Bread flour is the way to go for bread with height and substance. So now we have to knead the dough. Now that our dough is kneaded, we have to let this rise, which can take up to 2 hours as the dough doubles in size from the gas released by the yeast. To make sure that our bread doubles in size, we're going to use this handy height measuring appliance to mark our bread's height. Now, it's a rubber band. The way we can make sure it rises fully.
We're going to have our dough rise in the oven, where we can be sure the temperature is regulated. As a living organism, yeast prefers warm, moist environments to live in. Therefore, we're going to put a tray of water in the bottom of the oven where the bread rises so that it can work comfortably.
So already you can see how the sugar dough has risen a lot higher, a lot faster.
Even though the non-sugar dough has the potential to rise higher, it's unlikely that it will, so we're just going to move on.
Okay, so now we're going to do what's called punching down the dough. Sadly, it doesn't mean we're going to actually hit it, but the process is actually more like another kneading, except this time we're actually going to do it by hand.
This process is important because it redistributes the yeast cells and releases some of the gas. This allows for the bread to be more even in consistency and texture.
So now we're going to rest our doughs one more time. We're going to cover them in a warm, damp cloth. Remember any reasons why this would be important? That's right, yeast is a microscopic organism. It does its work best in moist, warm environments.
Alright, our dough is ready. It's done with its second rise. You can see already how Julia's dough, that's the sugared dough, is much bigger than the non-sugared dough.
Alright, but before we go on, we're going to separate each of these doughs into two pieces. This way, if there's difficulty during baking, we have another try. You can save dough by covering it in plastic wrap and putting it in the fridge, but be careful, it doesn't keep for very long. We're going to bake our bread in circle loaf shape, which means that we won't need any pans.
Okay, now it's time to bake. Ever wonder why fresh baked bread has cuts in the top? That's because it's been scored to allow for gas to release and expand while baking. Although the yeast does most of its leavening before baking, it does some final leavening in the oven. This time, the leavening is caused by the expansion of the gas bubbles due to the heat. If the bread is not scored, the gas bubbles will have no room to expand because they'll be trapped within the crust.
Okay, and now into the oven. We have it preheated to 350 degrees, and we're going to bake it for around 45 minutes. Into the oven goes our baking stone, which helps regulate the oven temperature by acting as a sort of buffer, absorbing and releasing heat as needed. It will also conveniently act as the surface that we're going to bake the bread on.
Alrighty, smells good. Now to cool. This part of the process is often overlooked, but it's still very important. Of course, the bread isn't going to rise anymore because the yeast died during the baking process, and there's no more heat like was in the oven to make the gas expand. However, the protein structure of the gluten cannot fully set if not given time to cool down. Heat has the effect of breaking bonds and weakening structure. So if we were trying to cut the bread while it's still hot, we could tear the bread or cause it to become misshapen.
Now that it's cool, we can finally finish our experiment by assessing which bread rose higher. My loaf is the bread baked with sugar, while Fia's is without sugar. The difference is very drastic, and it shows how yeast feeds on sugar to form gas for leavening. In the bread without added sugar, the yeast could only feed on complex carbohydrates, meaning that it could form less gas, causing it to be leavened less.
Okay, now that we're finished, let's recap.
Bread is leavened by gases, which make bubbles in the bread, helping it to rise.
Yeast is used in leavening bread because it makes carbon dioxide as a product when it eats sugar.
Leavening is helped by a strong protein network of gluten, formed from the proteins glutenin and gliadin when flour is mixed with water.
Yeast is a living organism, so it likes to work in warm, moist environments.
Because heat weakens structure, it's important to let bread cool so the protein structure can set.